let's discuss the gender pay gap. Recently, we've had big news from both Mumbrella and the mainstream media about the gender pay gap. And this is nothing new. There's been a persistent gender pay gap for as long as we can remember. But what does a median gender pay gap actually mean from a statistical and mathematical standpoint? What implications does that have for closing the gap? And what are the possible measures that can be undertaken to close the gap from a researcher perspective? And are those measures even possible? So Rigas, let's throw it over to you to begin this discussion. The gender pay gap. How do we solve this problem from a researcher perspective?
Yeah, Lee, you're right. It's been around forever. And one of the things I've always, and of course, there's a lot of political talk about why this has happened, what's happened in the past to keep this going, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we're going to leave that all behind today. We're not looking at why it's happened or why we're here. There's probably many, many reasons. Every single one of the reasons that commentators talk about is probably one of the reasons. You know what I mean? I don't think anyone's right or wrong. All of the aggregate reasons are probably the reasons. So that's not the issue. The issue is that these measurements are now taken in large organizations. I believe in businesses that turn over a certain amount of money are participating in this now. And Umbrella reported actually quite transparently on a number of media organizations and marketing organizations, obviously of interest to Umbrella, and they were named. And the gap was in fact printed. You know, this was the gap for this organization. This is the gap for this organization. Some were small, some were 4%, some were 24% gap, you know. But one thing I kind of, and maybe this is not the case because I haven't seen all of the data, of course, but one thing that occurred to me was that it was never the other way around. I don't think there was ever a situation where the pay gap was in the favor of the women in the organization. You know what I mean? So regardless of how big or small the gap was, it was always the women in the organization that seemed to be on the lower end of that. So let's look at it from a cold, hard business statistical point of view as we would as researchers, quite frankly. This is exactly what we would do. It's exactly what our clients would pay us to do, to look at it completely objectively with the hard facts in order to understand what it is and what is the solution. And unfortunately, it's going to bore us with a bit of stats. So let's just go back to the basics. What does a median mean? Because that's what they're reporting. So let's be very specific here. The reporting of the data is on medians, not on averages. I think that's fair enough. I mean, but what does a median mean? Of course, median is Latin. Not that I know any Latin, but I know median means the middle. Organization Acme Media plots the female median salary inside the organization. And for them, it's about 17% lower, which seems to me, when I was reading through those numbers, is probably the average. It's about 15% is the median pay gap roughly across organizations. I think, Nick, something like that. And that's what this means. It means we plot the bell curve of the women's salaries inside the organization, and it looks like that, and it follows roughly the same rules, right? Off a lower median or even average, and but it's still the same rules in terms of 1, 2, 3 standard deviations and the percentage of women in each of those bands. So immediately we can see that, okay, so the median for women is 17% lower, but that doesn't mean that there aren't very highly paid women. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't lower paid men, right? So the median means that it's kind of telling you where the midpoint is. So I've heard some politicians, as a result of, this data getting up, I don't know, it's a media grab, right? Which they need to do for mental availability, but they're saying things like, women earn less than men. Well, yes, sort of in a median sense, but if you look at this intersecting area between the male and female salaries in Acme Media, there's a lot of intersectionality here between men and women. There's a lot of overlap. So we could say there's a majority overlap, to be honest, statistically, right? Where there isn't an overlap is that there's a bigger percentage of women earning, the lower part of the median, and there's a smaller percentage earning the higher part of the median. So you can see this is where the gaps are. They're all over here, right? So what do we want to do? What we need to do, what Acme needs to do, is kind of just literally merge these bell curves, these salary bell curves, so that the medians match up. So in 3 years, when we take measurements again, Acme Media has a little to no pay gap.
So Rigas, as a non-statistical researcher, I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, wouldn't the easiest thing to do would be to reduce the median pay for men and increase the median pay for females? So sort of meet in the middle. Some men lose a little bit, some women gain a little bit, and then you have this equilibrium.
That's right. And in fact, Nick, that is one of the solutions. So might call a 100% staff meeting and say that, look, we don't want this anymore. We want to, for good reason, want to match up these medians, this pay gap. So what we need to come up with a strategy, everyone. So we want everyone to agree that you're right, Nick. Let's say, we will raise all female pay in the organisation by 5%, 7%, and we will lower all male pay in the organisation by 7%. Okay, and that way, next time we take measurements, will be matched. So statistically, mathematically, how we address this is that we do that. Either, there is an increase and a reduction of pay to meet somewhere in the middle so that the medians match up, right? Or Acme Media can't do that. The staff cannot agree to do that. And not only that, some of the staff threaten litigation because it means their salary would drop to below their contracted rate. It does really depend on the agreement of the people inside the organisation. But those are the hard facts. In order to match up the median pay gap between men and women in any one organisation, that organisation is going to both have to raise and lower the salaries of women and men respectively in order to match up the pay gap in the short term. That's what's necessary in order to do it very, very quickly. Because I've read a lot of companies say in response to this, of course, companies are interviewed and the HR people are interviewed, etc. And they keep saying we're doing a lot of work in this space, and which is corporate speak for, I don't know what it means. What do you mean you're doing a lot of work in this space? What are you doing? Because as far as you've just said, there's only about 3 things we can do. We can raise all women's salaries and or lower all men's salaries, right? As you said, to achieve. Or if we can't do that right now and we take a forward-loading approach, which means from now on we're going to correct it, it means in order to correct it even for the next few years, over the next few years, it means that you have to award a disproportionate amount of the higher-paying jobs to women and a disproportionate amount of the lower-paying jobs to men over a 2 to 3 year period at a ratio. I don't know what the ratio would be, but it would be a ratio.
The HR departments, the recruitment strategies, the diversity, inclusion and equity frameworks that have been established for large corporations and governments, all the way down to local governments and even medium-sized organizations. It's very, very clear that there's been a societal push to create equity and equality in terms of recruitment. So I actually don't see there being an obstacle in terms of the Anti-Discrimination Act, an obstacle to rectifying the issue with the median pay gap for women. I think that it would be almost impossible from a social, cultural, and political perspective to be able to prevent it. Maybe legalistically, from a technical point of view, but it would be incredibly unpopular. Incredibly unpopular.
We're talking now about the gender pay gap, right? We're not talking about diversity, inclusivity, and equity across the board. Look, let's look in our industry, right? Our industry. We've got a job for a senior group account manager, research director type person who's going to handle a bunch of clients, a senior job, you're going to have a bunch of people you're working with, the usual thing, right? A couple $100,000 a year, probably around that mark. I think that's where it's at roughly these days. Very senior role, very responsible, good money, all of that sort of stuff, right? So are you seeing anywhere that, the ad saying, and by the way, we will give priority to a female applicant for this particular one? Or, for example, the alternative job inside that media organization, which might be some kind of assistant who's going to be on the lower side of the median pay, right? When they're advertising for that job, have you seen an ad that says, and by the way, we are really looking to recruit a man for this particular job in our organization because we need more men on, in the lower pay gap, lower pay bands? Have you seen an ad like that?
You would never see an ad like that because it would be considered discriminatory.
Right. But in order to match the bell curves, that's what has to happen. So my senior director roles, if I'm the owner of the organization, the next 2 out of 3 senior director roles that come up for grabs not should be given to women, not should be, must be. Must be. Otherwise, I'm not going to get my bell curves matched up. And similarly, the graduate jobs coming out of uni, the research assistant jobs, etc., the project manager jobs, have to, the next 3 out of those, the 2 of them must be given to men. Not should be. Forget the should, because these gaps are all about, these gaps are the result of people saying what we should be doing. That's all they have. These gaps are the result of people saying what we should be doing without doing anything. It's not what I should be doing. Acme Media must do that to bridge the gaps, or they must call all the staff in and do the pay thing. But even if they do the pay thing, all the salary bands from there on must be equally populated, right? Which means that, let's say there are 4 jobs in the senior roles coming up, you've got to give 2 and 2, because otherwise your equilibriums are going to get out, your survey is going to, right?
The dangers of trying to impose society around a statistical model on a piece of paper is
okay, that's fine, Nick. So what are we arguing about then?
It would also require it to happen across the board. So every single company.
No, they don't. Because you're concerned about Acme Media. The results in Mumbrella were reported according to each company. So each company had a gender pay gap percentage next to it, right? So I don't care if my competitor, X Media, has a gender pay gap, right? I couldn't care less about them. I don't want one. In Acme Media, that's my organization, I don't want one. Or there's a public company organization and they don't want one, right? And in fact, they might even see it as a competitive advantage if they can publish the fact that they don't have a gender pay gap. You see what I mean? And our competitor does. You see what I mean? So it's kind of, it could actually be commercially beneficial in pitching for work even. We keep talking about it, and then when the cold, hard mathematical reality of what needs to happen in order to bridge this gap becomes apparent, everyone puts their hands up and says, oh, no, we can't do that. That's all I'm saying.